What if one of the most painful moments in Islamic history could teach us how to remain faithful when the world seems determined to make us surrender? More than 13 centuries have passed since Karbala, yet its memory continues to awaken hearts because it is not merely a story of tragedy. It is a profound lesson about faith, courage, sacrifice, and the responsibility of standing for what is right. To understand Karbala, we must first understand the world in which Imam Hussain, the beloved grandson of Prophet Muhammad, lived. After the passing of the Prophet, the Muslim community experienced tremendous changes, and generations later, political authority had become a deeply complicated matter. Imam Hussain belonged to the family of the Prophet and carried a unique place of honor among Muslims. He was the son of Ali ibn Abi Talib and Fatima, the beloved daughter of Prophet Muhammad. His life was shaped by revelation, worship, sacrifice, and the moral teachings of Islam. When political circumstances changed and allegiance to Yazid became a central issue, Imam Hussain faced an immense moral challenge. His decision was not simply about personal power or worldly authority. It became a question of principle, conscience, and responsibility before Allah. He understood that every choice could carry consequences, yet he refused to treat truth as something that could be exchanged for safety. This is where the story of Karbala begins to become more than history. It becomes a mirror for every generation. It asks what a believer does when remaining silent appears easier than standing firmly upon conviction. It asks whether faith is truly meaningful when it is convenient, or whether faith must remain strong when circumstances become difficult. Imam Hussain did not begin his journey toward Karbala seeking destruction. Historical accounts describe a complicated sequence of political developments, requests for allegiance, correspondence from people in Kufa, and changing circumstances that eventually brought him and his companions toward the land of Karbala. Along the journey, hopes and dangers existed side by side. The atmosphere became increasingly tense, and the possibility of peaceful resolution gradually narrowed. Then came a moment when the small group accompanying Imam Hussain found itself surrounded by a much larger force. The desert, which had once represented the openness of Arabia, became a place of confinement and uncertainty. Water became scarce, families faced hardship, and the pressure surrounding them intensified. Yet the greatest test was not simply physical. It was spiritual. Every passing moment increased the weight of the decision before them. The story was moving toward a day that would forever change the memory of Islamic history. And as the night before the final confrontation approached, the silence of Karbala carried a suspense that words can scarcely describe. Because by morning, sacrifice would reveal the depth of conviction. What happened next would become one of history's most enduring reminders that genuine courage is measured not by the absence of fear, but by the willingness to remain steadfast when fear surrounds the heart and mind. As the night of Karbala passed, the weight of what was coming became impossible to ignore. Imam Hussain and those who remained with him knew that the following day could bring the greatest sacrifice of their lives. Yet the atmosphere was not simply one of fear. It was also filled with prayer, reflection, remembrance of Allah, and steadfastness. The small group stood in remarkable contrast to the much larger force surrounding them. But numbers alone could not measure the strength of conviction. For Imam Hussain, the central question was never how to win a worldly battle. His journey had become a testimony of faith, dignity, and refusal to surrender principles under pressure. At dawn, the events of Ashura began, and Karbala entered one of the most painful chapters in Islamic history. The companions of Imam Hussain demonstrated extraordinary loyalty, while the members of his family endured circumstances that tested every dimension of human patience. One by one, those devoted companions gave their lives, leaving the camp increasingly isolated. The tragedy became more heartbreaking as members of the Prophet's family were also lost. Imam Hussain himself eventually faced the final moments of his earthly life, and his death transformed Karbala from a historical confrontation into a lasting symbol of sacrifice and moral courage. The suffering did not end with the battlefield. The survivors of the Prophet's family endured the aftermath, carrying the memory of what had happened at Karbala. Their journey became another chapter of hardship, but it also ensured that the lessons of that day would not disappear. This is where the deeper meaning of Karbala begins to emerge. The story is not meant only to make the heart grieve. It is meant to awaken the conscience. It reminds believers that truth can sometimes appear weak when measured by worldly power, yet moral strength can survive long after armies, rulers, and political structures have disappeared. The power surrounding Karbala was enormous, but centuries later, people still remember Imam Hussain because history preserved. Political structures have disappeared. The power surrounding Karbala was enormous, but centuries later, people still remember Imam Hussain because history preserved the meaning of his stand. Suspense had filled the desert before Ashura, but after the tragedy, another question emerged across generations. What should people learn from such sacrifice? The answer cannot be reduced to sadness alone. Karbala teaches that faith requires sincerity, that courage requires patience, and that principles become meaningful when they are protected during hardship. It also teaches that a believer should not measure success only through immediate worldly results. Sometimes a person may lose possessions, comfort, security, or even life, while leaving behind a legacy that influences generations. Imam Hussein's sacrifice became associated with steadfastness because he refused to allow fear of consequences to erase his moral responsibility. His story continues to remind Muslims that oppression, injustice, and moral compromise should never become normal simply because they are powerful or widespread. At the same time, Karbala calls for reflection rather than hatred, remembrance rather than revenge, and devotion to Islamic principles rather than division. Its enduring lesson is that true strength belongs to the person who remains connected to Allah when every worldly support seems to disappear. This is why, more than 14 centuries later, Karbala still speaks to hearts with extraordinary force. It asks every generation to examine its own choices, its own courage, and its own willingness to stand for truth when doing so becomes difficult. The desert of Karbala may belong to history, but its moral question remains alive wherever human beings face the choice between comfort and conviction, fear and faith, silence and principled action. The legacy of Karbala did not end when the dust of the battlefield settled. It continued through generations as a reminder that faith is not merely a feeling carried in peaceful moments, but a commitment that remains alive when circumstances become painful. Imam Hussein's sacrifice is remembered because it represents steadfastness in the face of overwhelming difficulty, and because his story invites believers to think about the values that shape their lives. In a world where people often measure success through wealth, influence, popularity, and power, Karbala presents a different measure. It teaches that dignity can be more valuable than comfort, truth more precious than worldly advantage, and sincere devotion to Allah stronger than fear of consequences. The lesson is powerful for anyone facing hardship. A person may experience rejection, uncertainty, disappointment, or pressure from others. Yet Karbala reminds the heart that hardship does not automatically mean failure. Sometimes the greatest test is simply remaining patient while the outcome is still hidden. Imam Hussein's story, therefore, becomes a source of reflection for believers who wonder whether their small acts of courage matter. They matter because every generation is shaped by the principles it chooses to protect. The events of Karbala also remind Muslims of the importance of justice, mercy, family, responsibility, and accountability before Allah. Remembering history should never become an excuse for hatred or division. Instead, it should encourage wisdom, self-examination, compassion, and a stronger commitment to the teachings of Islam. The tragedy carries grief, but its message can inspire hope because sacrifice made for a noble purpose can continue producing moral strength long after the people involved have passed away. More than 14 centuries later, the name of Imam Hussain remains connected with courage because his story survived beyond the political circumstances of his time. Kingdoms changed, rulers disappeared, generations were replaced, and civilizations rose and fell, but the moral questions surrounding Karbala remained. This is a powerful lesson. Worldly power is temporary, but moral choices can travel across centuries. When we remember Karbala, we should therefore ask ourselves what we are willing to sacrifice for truth, whether we protect our principles when nobody is watching, whether we remain patient when life becomes difficult, and whether our faith influences our actions rather than remaining in our words. Karbala teaches that courage does not always look like victory. Sometimes courage is simply refusing to abandon what is right. Sometimes patience means continuing forward when the destination cannot yet be seen. Sometimes sacrifice means giving up something beloved for a principle that has value. And sometimes the greatest victory is leaving behind a legacy that inspires people to become believers, better human beings, and more committed servants of Allah. The story of Karbala, therefore, remains a lesson in Islam's 1,400-year history, reminding every generation that truth may be tested, but sincere faith can endure. If you're benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.